We're doing well. It's now my great pleasure to introduce our guest speaker for this evening. Professor Peter Veth has carried out multi-decadal research on the archaeology of Aboriginal societies and their changing land and seascapes. This work has been carried out collaboratively with numerous communities, corporations and land councils for the purposes of strategic research, heritage management, native title and capacity building. He has held academic positions at JCU, the ANU and UWA. He's recently finished serving as the inaugural Kimberley Foundation Ian Potter Chair of Rock Art and is now the Director of the UWA Oceans Institute. Peter is head of the Archaeology Section, Australian Academy of Humanities, sits on the ARC College of Experts and is currently carrying out work in the Pilbara and the Kimberley. This is going to be most exciting. Tonight, he'll address us on a deep history of maritime peoples from northwestern Australia. Peter.
Thank you. Well, it's wonderful to be here. I'm going to take you on a 50,000-year voyage in 15 minutes, give or take a little bit. And I'll just see that we've got our pointer here. Okay. So this talk will actually look at a deep history of maritime peoples from northwestern Australia. I'm going to share some unique insights into what makes us in WA and the Northwest actually globally unique. And I'm going to consider the question of the blue economy, as you'll often hear it described today, towards social benefit, intensified seafood production and new economies, and reflect on how deep that blue economy may actually be here in Western Australia. As normal, I also acknowledge that we're on the Whadjuk clans of the Noongar-speaking nation. I also pay my respects to other communities who are named here and others who are not, and particularly to elders past, present and emerging. So UWA is actually part of a CRC for Blue Economy. The contracts are just being signed, but we have actually been awarded a very large national project with many partners. It's about a $330 million CRC. It's going to look at a whole range of things which you see on the board here now: seafood production, use of offshore platforms, renewable energy, biodiversity and conservation values. We are mainly working around the platform and renewable energy sector. And you'll hear a lot about this as the PhDs and postdocs and national programs develop. It's very exciting. In fact, we're the only institution west of Melbourne in this group of about 40, so it's significant that we're there. But our region also has a unique record. It has a unique record of seafood use and reliance. And in fact, if you look at this map and consider the movement of modern peoples from Africa through Southern Asia to Australia, we actually find that some of the earliest evidence out of the old world for reliance on maritime resources, for extraordinary seafaring opportunities and competencies, comes from northwest Australia and our nearest area, and that's quite incredible. So 2 million years ago, people are so-called lacustral riverine. They use freshwater tortoises. They are relying on a whole range of things like catfish. Then with the dispersal of modern peoples, we see evidence of coastal occupation, and we see shellfish being used and seals being preyed on and a whole range of other things. But it is only in the last 50 or 60,000 years that there is direct and indirect evidence for deliberate voyaging across islands and sea voyaging. And there's also a remarkable record just coming out in our neck of the woods in the last 5 years. So if you look at the top of that diagram on the right, you'll see fish hooks, pelagic fish, boats, and a range of other marine resources. And it's just that last package of which the global story has some of the best representation and records here. Now, we don't know how the first Australians specifically came out. We know from ethnohistoric and other resources and records, and these are from museum displays, that people used tidal rafts in the Kimberley, they used lateen-rigged outriggers in the Pacific, a whole range of very fast and hand-propelled vessels in Southeast and Southern Asia, which could actually outperform a Dutch steam patrol vessel, for example, in the 1860s, and also these incredible lugger toys you see in the bottom left-hand side. So we don't know exactly what technology was used, but what we do know from the reconstructions I've done with many colleagues, and there are papers just from the last couple of years, is that during lowered sea levels, and for much of human history, the sea has been much lower than now. 12,000 years ago, you could walk to Rottnest, to Tasmania. The actual ice caps of the north and southern hemisphere locked up sea into these massive ice bodies, and so the sea was as low as 130 metres during the last ice age. That has huge implications for human movement. And what we see here are the extended, I'll just show you this. This is the northern Australian coast, this is the Kimberley, and at about 60,000 years ago, this is what northwest Australia looked like. Huge shoals, massive seabird, turtle and other kinds of resources spread through here. And that's the gap to Timor. In fact, of the best modelling, you can see the Sahul Shelf in Australia from West Timor and Navarrete at 60,000 years ago. A number of studies, including ours, have done historic. A number of studies, yeah, I'll take the microphone, thank you, have used both genetic data and a whole range, thank you, of simulations of voyages of boats setting off from these areas. And you'll see that in these areas there would be successful voyaging over just 2 or 3 days. So it is deliberate. The genetics suggest that there are large groups of people, and there's no way this is an accidental dispersal. And so what other evidence do we get? Well, we're actually getting direct maritime evidence from Timor-Leste, where I've worked with colleagues since 2000, the Aru Islands, and back into Sulawesi and Borneo from a range of colleagues. So we're getting art and symbolic evidence at this very early stage, in fact, the earliest in the world for figurative art, and also the marine evidence. And these are just a few of the items that we found in Timor. So I was excavating with a team from ANU. These are actual shell fish hooks, and they came from metres down in the deposits, and they were direct dated at 10,000. The continuing work has got them back to 20, 30, 35,000 years ago. That pelagic fish you see there, there are remains of that in huge numbers at 40, 45,000 years ago. And what you see there are harpoons, fish harpoons, which are also coming out of East Timor. We also have an extraordinary record, both in the Kimberley as the dating advances there, but also into the Walasian Islands and Borneo, which you can see in the dotted area in the top left. We have early figurative art of things like babi rusa. These are the deer kangaroo, or a deer pig, I should say, from Borneo. This is direct dated, overdated with uranium series at 40,000 years. There's material coming through labs at the moment from colleagues over east, and they're direct dating, or minimum dating, I should say, figurative art at 45,000. That's earlier than Spain, France. This is a revolution in our own neck of the woods. But we also find things like shell bead necklaces, ornaments, and there you can see some of the shell beads in the middle. And they've been found at Northwest Cape. They're being found as parts of ornate objects in these Timor excavations. And they're, again, going back to 40, 45,000 years. So we've got people with symbolic complexity, with maritime competencies, and that's in our neck of the woods. Right, I'll just grab a drink here. So Barrow Island is probably known to you for its mining history, for Harry Butler, for the conservation work done there. I worked with Harry Butler before he passed away, and a whole range of others who supported our work. Why I was interested in the Montebellos in the early days, before we got co-sponsored for Barrow, was these are islands on a continental shelf. They sample a large landscape that is now drowned. In fact, much of the 45, 50,000 years of human history and environmental records will be in limestone areas, calcarenite like Barrow and the Montebellos. They're unique records. You just don't get this kind of limestone geology until you're in the Devonian or further up in the Kimberley. And so we worked for years earnestly on the Montebellos. We found lots of nuclear material, as you'd expect. We made sure it was safe in the radiation sense, but we found tiny pockets of midden that were dated back to 35,000 years. And the coast wasn't actually at the Montebellos. It was within 5 to 10 kilometres away, because it keeps going up and down with these glacial episodes. And so we knew that people were using the very old coastal plain. They were using shellfish and fish and crocodile and things like that, and they were transporting some of it across the coastal plain. So we have desert maritime people in the northwest. And we have, if you like, in Atlantis, an unfolding of a unique record. So we surveyed the entire Barrow Island, or a good proportion that we could. We had teams from the US, around Australia. We spent 3 years. We found some very important sites in the open, which are unique because they predate sea level rise. Barrow Island has only been an island for the last 7,000 years. For much of the time before that, you could walk there. But we also found some small caves, and we found some burnt shellfish, and Harry Butler and others had noted that there were some unusual things. And we were working with mainland communities as well, as part of normal surveys, and this one cave called Booty Cave was found or re-examined. And this is a huge cave. It's 100 metres long. That's a laser image of the entire structure. You can see the cross-section down the bottom. Just imagine walking for 100 metres in the dark. And there's metres of deposit, and there are bats. I mean, they're burrowing bettongs. But what we could do in the front of the cave was get into the light area where they weren't burrows and where people had lived. So here, at the front of the cave, we excavated for 3 years, carefully with big teams, and we had to comply with health, environmental, safety, quarantine conditions. We had to process material with a range of chemists and paleontologists, and we did that with good local support from Barrow and other communities. And so what this shows is one of the pictures inside when we do our excavations in that light zone. And they went down metres, and they recorded human occupation from 7,000 years ago, when it became an island, and then nothing after that, so it clearly fell out of use because it was so far offshore. And before that, we went back down to more than 50,000 years. And although you'll hear earlier dates quoted, and of course Aboriginal people ontologically and in a worldview believe they've always been in country, and I'll talk about that later, but here we were finding records that pushed back the known evidence of use of marine resources and indeed occupation for Australia. It was just before the Northern Territory dates broke. So when you look at them statistically, and we use 4 different labs from Oxford, from Australia, from New Zealand, we do luminescence dating of sediments, we do radiocarbon, and we do them blind, so the labs have no idea what the others are getting in their results. And we end up with these chronologies from these very, very careful excavations and processing teams, which include ecologists, which include geologists, which include dating specialists. And we end up finding artefacts which don't belong on a limestone island. These are volcanic artefacts and metamorphic that clearly came, and we've done sourcing studies from the Pilbara, from the Murchison. They're covering the entire coastal plain, which of course was there as an Atlantis landscape. We find shellfish that are being transported up to 20 to 30 kilometres off the old coastal plain. We have evidence of mangroves, which the ecologists didn't know. And we find a whole range of other things like the edge-ground axe in the bottom there, and you've probably seen them in the Kimberley or in some of your travels. They're only meant to have been around for 5,000 years in this area. They're not 20, 30,000 years. Anyhow, we did the things that archaeologists and quaternary scientists do. We did lots of modelling. We look at different discard patterns of the stone tools, of the dietary faunas, and there was lots of land-based fauna as well. There were things like bandicoots. There are 50,000 on Barrow now, no surprise there. Lots of arid zone fauna, crocodiles and other things that you may not have expected, but species like the nail-tailed wallaby, which is now in the tropical distribution. So we know that we're looking at different climate regimes. And we've done work on the speleotherms, on the climate records, again with different specialists to reconstruct or try and provide a new quaternary climate record for the northwest. And this picture is a collapsing of about 400 other graphs and tables which show that people are there from 52,000 years ago continuously until it becomes an island, and it's very far offshore and probably quite difficult and dangerous to go to. And here I've just got a few quick images of the sorts of shellfish that we find the remains of. So they're from mangroves. We actually find crabs, bivalves, and a whole range of other things, including the baler shells, which are used for artefacts. That's the bottom one. but they're also in very large form traded all the way into the desert as water carriers and also for other purposes. So I've found and worked with people who found Baler shell and pearl shell in South Australia, in Central Australia, in the East Pilbara, and we can trace them back to these parts of northwest Australia. So a massive circulation pattern across Australia. And then, as I said before, a range of animals, and there are hundreds, this goes on for ages and ages. There are hundreds of animals that show this as an arid sand plains environment, but coastally incredibly rich. And there's that message, there's that pointing arrow, if you like, of the coastal productivity. It is something that we are now harnessing with the Blue Economy CRC, but it's part of the legacy of WA in the northwest. And so here I am, big team in the background, and it's the last stage of the excavation, and we've actually got remains, a large processing area, and there's turtle, there's porpoise, there's crocodile, there's remains of shark. There's actually heat stones that are placed inside the carapace of the turtle to cook them 8,000 years ago. This is pretty unique. Large fish, crab, sea urchin, freshwater shellfish, macropods, lizards, you go on. This is a veritable seafood basket. It's an incredibly rich environment. It's much richer than paleoecology probably thought. And so this is like the last signal of the coast coming to the island like it would to Rottnest or to indeed Cottesloe, which is now coastal. People are exploiting this incredible range of resources, but we actually sample the previous sea level stands. We can see down into the water with the record that punctuates and goes before it. We find things like beads, shells, tusk shells, snapped, ground with evidence of hair string and ochre on them. We could do some non-destructive dating, which we did, and they're 12,000 years old. And these are actually worn in completely open contexts by people in the Kimberley, both historically and more recently. And these are just pictures of young children who are actually wearing a range of tusk shell necklaces. We also find tusk shells traded into the interior of Australia, and again we have necklaces, broken necklaces, which is the last thing I showed you, which we look at microscopically and see if there's any human hair string and so forth, and they're going back 30, 40,000 years. So this is an incredibly potent record of marine use. And then there is a gap in the Barrow Island record. It's picked up everywhere in the coastal Pilbara and the inland. But then we start to see evidence of the American whalers. There's some earlier evidence of contact to the north, and then the pearling fleets. And in the early days, they're fairly unregulated. It's a robust industry. It's not very sustainable. That's why Broadhurst pearling, dry shelling in Shark Bay ran out. That's why they had to move up the coast. Shark Bay was the first pearling ground, before Tenzing, before Broome, before Torres Strait. So it's an incredible, again, very early record and very innovative. Anyhow, Aboriginal people, including others from the islands, were indentured into the early pearling teams. And there were crashes in supply and demand in both whaling and the pearling fleets. And there were actually very large ones based in the Dampier Archipelago and further. My colleague Joe McDonald and others have actually found whalers' inscriptions and the names of the boats and the teams on rock art, near Aboriginal rock art, and on it on the Dampier Archipelago, or Murujuga as it's called. You might have seen that in the press. And this is one of the images of them recording Jacob Anderson off the Connecticut, I think in 1841. So these records are only starting to be picked up in the Dampier Archipelago through more systematic survey. But there are these fairly hard and harsh records of early explorers and pastoralists, and they are kind of buccaneers. And here's a quote simply saying, "We brought people down from the Kimberley to the pearling grounds of Barrow Island," or they say the pearling grounds, "to civilise them." It's a robust attitude. It's clearly one that wasn't going to last. And it helps us explain why on Barrow Island, when we looked at the more recent record, we found glass Kimberley points. You'll see some of them out there. I brought them along tonight. They're historically significant because Kimberley people at contact in the archaeological record today, if they're making them for particular purposes, make special, beautiful bifacial, bidirected points. They look like a laurel leaf. It's like the French traditions and others around the world. It's distinctly, culturally, stylistically, isochrestically Kimberley, not anywhere to the south. And we found these large historic sites with evidence of copper sheathing, Kimberley points, but in glass only, and a whole range of other artefacts in Bandicoot Bay. And this is an aerial view and an oblique view of the excavation, and that provided about 40 50 complete points. There are 3 out there. There'll be some in the new museum, which will be central to understanding that labour history, as well as the original artefacts from the Barrow Island excavation. And about 500,000 pieces of glass. It's the biggest reduction contact site, as well as buttons from Malacca Straits Police, pendants made from coins, and a whole range of other historic material. In fact, on South Island, we excavated an entire structure, a large building and a supply building in limestone under the dune. And there was just a small bit poking out, and when the excavation was finished, it was clear it was used for supplies. It was part of an early barracooning labour industry. And so here's some of the images of the points, and you'll start to see them in the museum. You'll see them up in Onslow because the communities will display them and use them for interpretation. And there are some back on the island in the Harry Butler Centre, which is an interpreter centre to educate people coming onto the island. And here's just a view of an Aboriginal man, a Wororan man in the early 1900s, recorded by Elkin. He worked with him for quite a while, and he's making these beautiful glass points. And they become so sought after. The British Museum and all of these other collectors around the world start collecting them. And if you go to the National Museum, go to the new museum here, you'll see hundreds of them. It was cash, it was trade. But we know from the records from people like Reverend Love and others, these were not just artefacts for spearing and for procurement. They were aesthetic, they spoke of country, they spoke of home. That's why they've been found on Wodgumup at Rottnest. That's why they've been found in the south, because people made them when they were away from country, and that's what's happened in Barrow. Those teams were recruited from the Pilbara, from the Western Desert, and a whole range of areas in an indentured labour system, which then became regulated because there were complaints from the Swan River colony, from the magistrates in the north, and even from the governors of Kupang, the Dutch governors. It was an industry that needed to pop out, and it did. But it was, it's part of our history. It's a very quasi and a real tragic one, but that is a classic example of a labour industry and a marine resource use that didn't survive. And yet it built on, as far as we can tell, at least 50,000 years of sustainable resource use. Here there are images of big fish traps, of large weirs made from reeds that are used to trap fish in northern Australia, dugong hunting seeds, some of Aboriginal women collecting shellfish, and then historic scenes of people working on the luggers, both diving, and early on they went diving. Some people had never been in the water. They came from the East Pilbara and taken out. But clearly Kimberley people were brought down as part of this industry. It then became reformed because it was part of the reform of the West Australian labour industry, and to become the maritime industries we see today. So what I'd like to do is finish on both a reflective and a positive note, and simply say, was there probably a DNA or an inheritance of the original blue economy? There was clearly social abundance. There was some of the earliest symbolic art behaviour anywhere in the world in our region. There's clearly a record of sustainable seafood resource use. There's no extinction recorded in any of the seal or seafood populations. There's debate about megafauna, happy to talk about it later, but there is no record of extinction. And so it does leave us with a comp morale. It leaves us with a message. We have to think about sustainability into the future, the best technologies, the biggest challenges, and the best minds we have at UWA and our partnerships. We'll look at sustainable seafood production, we'll look at renewable energy, and we'll look at recycling and reusing platforms so that we become part of what I see as a 50,000-year DNA. Thank you.
No, stay here, Peter, please. Well, if you want someone who's enthusiastic about their job, I think we've just seen it. And isn't it great that research can capture and captivate so much in the individual who does it, but is so enthralling to everyone who can intersect with that. So, Peter, beautifully done. Thank you so much. I think if I dig under here somewhere.
Oh, thank you.
It works. I better put the right words with it. On behalf of Convocation Council, I'd like to present Peter with some quality wine sourced from the vineyards of our graduates. Where else could they come from? The impact of UWA's graduates on the West Australian wine industry is well known, and we're extremely fortunate that they regularly support Convocation. Peter.
So am I, Doug.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, mate.